New limitations and restrictions were introduced the beginning of this year to California's rent control law. How do you know if your property is exempt? So I went and asked one of the top real estate attorneys here in Long Beach, what properties are exempt?
While there are a number of somewhat esoteric exemptions, the three exemptions, actually the two exemptions which are most significant, that I'll mention the third as well, is that if you have a single family residence that is not owned by a real estate investment trust, is not owned by a corporation, or is not owned by an LLC in which one of the members is a corporation, there is an opportunity for a single-family residence exemption. Now, where this exemption statute is different than other types of rent control, LA and other areas, in LA, if you own a single-family residence, without any qualifications, without any additional action required, you're exempt from the LA rent control. However, under the new law that went into effect as of the first of this year, you have an obligation to educate the tenant about the potential applicability of these new laws, as well as your claim that you are exempt. If you do not assert the exemption properly, you do not include the statutory language that is required, you will not be exempt from the regulations. And generally speaking, those single-family residence exemption applies to anything that can be a property that can be transferred by a separate deed, which includes primarily single-family residences and condos. Now, the other general area where there's an opportunity for an exemption as well is in the area of auxiliary dwelling units, or ADUs. Now, on the ADUs, it's interesting because they will provide an exemption to the just cause eviction requirements, but not an exemption from the rent cap limits. So it is important to distinguish the two. Now, what's also interesting is, given that the ADUs were added a little bit later in the game, as far as the legislation goes, the notice requirements that are in place for single-family residences don't apply to the ADUs. Probably still the better practice to go ahead and use those same exemptions so that when you're asserting them.
Now, and in discussing exemptions, Bruce, you mentioned single-family homes, you mentioned condos and ADUs. What about duplexes? When we get into multifamily, if the owner is owner-occupied of a multifamily, are they exempt?
Well, the owner-occupied issue is one that applies to any residential rental property, not just to duplexes or single-family. So if there's a requirement that you have a specific provision in the agreement that allows for eviction based upon owner occupancy. But one strange quirk on that is, if you don't have that provision and you want to add that provision, you have the right to do so. And a failure of a tenant to agree to that new provision in and of itself is a grounds for just cause eviction, because the code specifically says it is not a dissimilar provision. Which is a mouthful, but the short version is there's always a solution to be had if it's going to be a buyer or even any owner as an owner-occupant.
So we've learned which properties are exempt from the limitations and restrictions. If you have any questions, you can either comment them below or give me a call. See you next time.